Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Messianic Bible Study with me, Zeli. So, I missed last week, and I apologize for that. For my vast audience that really was hoping for an episode, especially because we're going to be talking about slavery, as you can see right there in that first subheading. I know everybody's really curious about this, but let's just jump right into it. Exodus 21. This is, of course, a continuation of the tablets of stone. This would be written on the tablets of stone. When you see those pictures of Moses carrying those massive tablets, and it only has like literally 10 letters, an aleph, a bet, a gimel, and dalet, and all that sort of stuff. That's like just all it has. That's most likely not what was going on there. Most likely, you would have the front and the back of each tablet written on, and you would have, and this is coming from Meredith Klein's book that I mentioned last week, I believe. You would have both sides being written on, and also a lot of writing, like little writing, and a lot of it. And it wouldn't be that you'd have 5 commands on one side and then 5 on the other. You'd have all the commands on one side and all of the commands on the other. And the reason was because typically when you would have like this two tablets that you wrote the covenant on, you would give one to the king, like the great king, and one to the vassal king, one to the greater nation and one to the lesser nation. They would be tablets of testimony. And what that means is they would be sort of a written record of the covenant. So you could reference it whenever you needed to. You just be like, oh, well, there's the covenant. Let's see. Did you break it here? Yes. Yes, it looks like you did. Or did you break it? No. Okay, you're all in the clear. That's sort of how it would turn out, or that's the image we should have in our head. Like, let me see if I could look up this for you. Let's see. Let's see. I'm gonna look at the Misha Stele. Yeah, this is what it would look like this. You can see it's these are even in like somewhat familiar letters if you grew up believing in Paleo Hebrew, but like you can see that a lot of these are very similar to Hebrew letters. These would be the Phoenician. This would be the Phoenician alphabet, and so you have, of course, the sh here, and then I think that's a b sound and all that. But anyway, so this is what you would be looking at here. This, and it wouldn't be just the Decalogue over and over and over again. And then you would have the same thing on the other side. You just have a continuation on the other side. And then you would have, of course, a second one. And the second one would be a replica of the first one. And one of these would be given to the nation and the nation that's being ruled, and the other one would be given to the nation that's ruling. Now, of course, because this is a particular kind of covenant that's being made between God and his nation Israel, you would be looking not quite at one tablet going to God and one going to the nation of Israel, but they would both be in the Ark of the Testimony. And the Ark of the Testimony being God's footstool in the spiritual realm, it would also be, the wording that's used in some parts of Scripture and in the Pentateuch, and I will point it out when I get there. But Michael Heiser references this, and he talks about how God says, "I call to witness heaven and earth against you," and the whole point is that in other nations, when you would have this covenant that's being made, you would have the God calling to witness other gods, so that it's not just, or sorry, it would be the great king calling to witness the gods, so that if the dispute arises between the great king and the lesser king, the gods will judge between the two of them. Now, God, of course, cannot swear by anybody or call to witness anybody greater than himself, but he can call to witness what you might think are neutral judges. And of course, God is a neutral judge, but lest we believe that he's in it for himself, he says, I'm not even going to call myself to witness. I'm going to call to witness heaven and earth, because they're always there. And so he calls heaven and earth to witness against the people of Israel when he gives them the testimony. And the ark of the testimony, where that has the ark of the testimony that has the tablets of the testimony, inside of it is covered by two cherubim, and cherubim would be like divine throne room guardians. And so you couldn't go in there without being like having to confront the guardians. You need an invitation to go in there, and that's what happens on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. But they also sort of represent heaven and earth. Of course, let's see, there you could say heaven, and then earth might be the bread and the trees that are in the temple. And the idea is that the personification of heaven and earth are watching everything that's going on, and they are witness to everything that's going on. And so whether God is in the wrong or whether man is in the wrong, they will tell. And of course, God's never in the wrong. It's always man, naturally. So that's sort of what's going on with those tablets of the testimony being put into the ark of the testimony. And so this next section, this next chapter, would be on the tablets that Moses is bringing down. And so let's read it. And you know, there's a lot that's going to be on the tablets. Basically everything from here to, well, we'll get there. But basically everything from here until like Genesis or Exodus 30. Yeah, that all would be on these tablets, and these are all one covenant. So let's continue. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door of the or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. When men quarrel, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die, but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall have him thoroughly healed. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to this same rule. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. When one man's ox butts another's so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also they shall share. Or if it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. Okay. Exodus 21. So we begin with laws about slaves. Now, the important thing to note is, one second. Okay, so the important thing to note about this is whenever you're reading any sort of laws, books of law, or like in your own nation, or if you're talking about the Bible and you're talking about divine law, you have to make a distinction between descriptive and prescriptive. And then, of course, you have to make a distinction between deontological and case law. And so case law, prescriptive laws are basically, that's the rule. Descriptive laws, where it describes a situation that happened, and we talked about this when we talked about Dinah and her rape. Descriptive laws give you nuance to the rule. And it's the same thing with the case laws versus deontological principles. If it says do not kill or something along those lines, that's a deontological principle. You do not break that. Case law will give you nuance to that deontological principle, to that prescription. So here in Exodus, we have a mixture of both, Exodus 21. And it says, now these are the rules that you shall set before them, the people of Israel, and also by extension us, because we are part of the people of Israel. You have the Jews and you have the Christians, and Paul says that Christians have become Jews at heart, which means Christians are Israel at heart. They have been grafted onto the tree of Israel, and the Jews are their brothers, essentially. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. So the very first thing, of course, is when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go out free for nothing. Now, the implication of Hebrew, the word Hebrew that's used there, we're not entirely sure if it had this meaning at the time, but in Judaism, a Hebrew is somebody who has crossed over. It's somebody who has converted. That's why Abraham is called a Hebrew, while Isaac and Jacob, they're not necessarily called Hebrews. They're just the people in covenant with God. They're born in covenant with God. So when you buy a Hebrew slave, so if you have a slave and he's Hebrew, you can only have him for 7 years. That's the rule. He shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go out free for nothing. Now, this is a bit of a problem because when you're talking about people in slavery in those days, very rarely did you find somebody who just straight up stole somebody. It would be somebody who's in authority, is selling their child. This happens like in the Philistines, for instance. And of course, it's terrible over there because it's typically young women and they get sold into trafficking and all that sort of stuff. But somebody in authority would sell a child or something like that. And this happened with Joseph and his brothers. Joseph wasn't kidnapped, although he was technically stolen because the brothers didn't have authority over him, but the Ishmaelites wouldn't have known. They looked the other way. They're like, we don't what was it? Don't say, don't tell, something like that. We're assuming on good faith that you are doing the right thing here as you're selling your brother, who might be your son, might be your brother. I don't know. He's 17. You guys look older, so whatever. That's sort of what was going on there. Or a person would go into debt and he would sell himself. Typically, you don't sell people into slavery, yourself or your children, just for fun. That's just not what happens. You sell them into slavery because you're going in debt, which is why and then typically you would sell them either to somebody, to the person who is paying your debt, or somebody who you are indebted to, or you would sell them to somebody who has enough money to pay off your debt. And they would do that. And then you would be instead indebted to that person, but they took the child or you, and therefore the debt is cleared. There's no more debt. However, there is always the opportunity for redemption, and that is the slave can buy his own freedom, or his kinsman can buy his freedom. That's just that's the opportunity. Now, God here, like this is background. God here is saying, on top of those ways that the slave can become free, if it's a Hebrew slave, he just automatically becomes free after 7 years. Now, we did this in America a little bit, which shows the heart of some people. But in America, we took a lot of Irish slaves, in addition to the transatlantic slave, like the African slaves. And the rule was for the Irish slaves that you could only have them for 7 years, presumably following this rule. But what happened then was the masters, being sadistic SOBs, decided that that meant that they were useless after 7 years. So as their time came to a close, they would amp up their abuse of these Irish slaves, and they would beat them harder. They would sometimes sever limbs, and oftentimes, like close to the end of the 7 years, they would just kill them for no reason, because that's the sadistic nature of the antebellum South, at least the 5% that owns slaves. And well, a percentage of that 5%. Here, though, we get a myriad of rules that would make that impossible for anybody. who is obeying God. Okay. So he shall serve him 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go out free for nothing. So first of all, those Irishmen, they should have just gone out free for nothing, and that's exactly what those antebellum people were afraid of. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. So what's this saying is, if a man sells himself into slavery to pay his debt and provide for his family, he's not selling himself and his family. He's selling himself. And even if he does sell himself and his family, like himself and his wife, into slavery, she's still his wife. And she still goes out free with him. If he is brought into the family and the master gives him a wife, then she doesn't get freed along with him. And this is just sort of like, if she's a Hebrew, then she'll be set free after her 7 years are up. So maybe he goes out, then she goes out a year later. Actually, yeah, a year later or so. If she's a non-Jew, then she would never go out unless she's redeemed. And so then her husband could go out, make some more money, and then redeem her. So that's sort of how it would work. And this is also because, like, you recognize that if you are in a slave owning society and you pay money to have a slave, it's a huge detriment to just have all your slaves go out free. Like, you would never give one slave in marriage to another if that was the case, if that was what was going to happen. And so this was a way to promote the production of children. And this is actually a form of justice because it's God's law and everything is just. And so you have to think, okay, well, yeah, it seems unjust to the slave himself, but it is just for the master because he paid for this person, and that's just how it goes. If the slave wants then, and it says here, if the slave wants to not wait 2 years for his wife to be freed, then he will do this whole ear in the all thing. And this is because he's a terribly foolish person. He can't wait 2 years to like working for his wife and preparing a house for her, or he's too lazy or whatever. So he just wants to allow somebody else to rule over him. And this part here, when it says, if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her masters, and he shall go out alone. So the wife and her children, meaning like, if all of these people are Hebrews, then they'll go out. They go out after 7 years. If they are non-Jews, then they have to be redeemed. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God. And the reason? Because this is a horribly shameful thing to do. Why would you do this? His master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Why? Because he's an idiot. That's why. When a man, I guess, I could supplement this with a discussion by Aristotle on slavery as well. Aristotle actually came to a very similar conclusion that the Bible comes to, but different. Aristotle said, like, not that different, but a little different. But Aristotle sort of went through the thought experiment, thinking about, like, okay, well, what sort of slavery is just slavery? Is it by ancestry? He says, no, it can't be by ancestry because there are people who are natural masters that are born to natural slaves. Well, is it then by color or race? He says, no, because people in the barbarian nations oftentimes are better than the masters or like slaves from barbarian nations are oftentimes better than masters from the Greek world. And so what is it? Is it this? Is it this? He says none, like it's none of that. A true just slavery would be somebody who's a natural master paired with somebody who's a natural slave. And how he defines a natural slave is somebody who is unable to care for himself. He's able to work, he's able to do all that sort of stuff, but uh he cannot order a household. He cannot lead a household. He does, like, he's just, let's say he's terrible with money. Let's say he's addicted to alcohol. Let's say he's uh, uh, mentally inept in one way or another. These would be what Aristotle calls natural slaves. And these are people who, if you just let them go free, they'll basically be eaten by wolves because they can't fend for themselves. And so you pair them with somebody who can take care of them and who are guarded by a law that will protect the rights of both individuals. And that's sort of what you're seeing here in the Bible. This guy is an idiot, which means, of course, he'd be a natural slave. Or perhaps he had it better with his master. He doesn't know how to fend for himself. He doesn't know how to order a household. He doesn't know how to work a field and lead people. Let's say, all he wants to do is be a factory worker. And he doesn't know how to do anything else. He doesn't know how to manage a company, manage a household, or manage a family. He outsources all of that, in other words. The master is the outsourced management. And of course, we talk about slavery, and it's just a four-letter word for us because of how we experienced it here in America. But a good example, and I know this is almost sacrilegious, but in Game of Thrones, there was the blonde lady, the young blonde lady that was sold to the barbarian tribe and everything, dragon, mother of dragons or whatever. And she, of course, had an a priori presupposition that slavery is wrong in all instances, sort of like we have. So she went to a foreign nation, conquered it, and just freed all the slaves. That's what she did. And she abolished all the slavery rules, and the entire society degenerated into chaos. And you had her judging people's, let's say, judging their disputes because she's the new ruler. And they would oftentimes come up to her and say, this is the order of our society. I need to make money. How am I going to train up my son? I don't have enough money to hire a tutor. I do have enough money to feed an extra mouth. So how are we going to do this? And she was sort of finagled into allowing certain forms of slavery in her society because she realized that there were instances where it was better than to have a bunch of worthless freemen. It's better to have those freemen under the headship and householdship of another person who is able to manage a household. And that's what the Bible here is talking about. People who are unable to manage their household are under the household in the family of another person. They've basically sold themselves to the family of another person so that they can have an ordered household without having to worry about it. Now we get into another section, and this is controversial only because people don't think about it. I think I talked last time about secular morality, for instance. And if you are presupposing a secular morality, you have absolutely no reason to believe that slavery is wrong. If you don't believe in the Bible, you have no reason to believe slavery is wrong. And why is that? Because there's there's just no reason it is. Okay, so let's say slavery is wrong. Why is slavery wrong? Well, because it's removing freedoms from somebody. Why is that wrong? You throw people in prison. Yeah, well, they deserve it. Well, how do they deserve it? Or maybe they don't deserve it. And so you just allow these criminals to run rampant in the streets, and you see the degeneration of civilization. So you throw people in prison, you remove their freedoms from them. Why is that? Because they have proven that to society that they are unable to manage themselves. So you get other people to manage them. Now imagine if those people, they didn't commit crimes. All they did was they fell on hard times. Let's say the homeless people. I live in Seattle, and so you have rampant homelessness. So what do you do with them? Well, we give them homes. Well, then they don't know what to do with those homes because they don't know how to manage a household. You give them money. Well, they spend it all because they don't know how to manage money. Okay, you give them food, you give them all the amenities that they could need, all the amenities that somebody else who doesn't know how to manage a household or manage money or manage a home, they could survive and thrive on and even make more wealth out of that. These people cannot because they don't have the tools. They can work really hard to gain the tools. And then, well, I think I've mentioned before, like I was homeless. I grew up homeless for 17 years. I worked really hard for a decade to live in the slum because I had to gain the tools to manage money, to manage a household. It was a lot of work. Every single person can do that. If I didn't want to do that, I could have easily just continued being homeless and being living in a way where I survive, but I do not have much autonomy. Now take that concept, these people who can work really hard to become members of society, or they can just continue doing what they're doing. Take that concept and add free market, add families to that. So they don't have the state paying for them, but instead they fall under one family or another. Oh, wait, I was going somewhere else with that. Essentially, if you do not believe in the Bible, you have no reason to say that slavery is wrong except for your own sentiments. And essentially, you say, I don't like slavery, therefore it's wrong. But that's not how morality works, and I'm sorry, but it's not. Then you think, okay, well, nature, it's against nature because every person is free by nature, but they're not. And that's what Aristotle was talking about. There are people who are not free by nature. They do not have the tools to manage themselves. Let's say they have below 80 IQ. That would be somebody who is not free by nature. They don't have the tools to manage themselves, or at least it's very, very difficult. And it would be simpler just to have for them to have something that they could go to where they didn't have to manage themselves. And some people could freely choose that and decide to sell themselves. So that's an option. Essentially, there's absolutely no argument that you can make from a non-biblical perspective that slavery is wrong. You have to presuppose that people are by nature made in God's image, by nature free, and not and that they're all by nature equal. And that's sort of the made in God's image argument. You have to presuppose that people are all equal. And in order to do that, you have to presuppose a God. You cannot say that people are all equal just as a brute fact, and then let's say, then you just look out into the world, look at the empirical realities. People are not all equal. We all have different tastes. We all have different skills. And some people have more skill, like just as a straight measure, an objective measure, some people have more skill than others. If we're talking about conscientiousness, if we're talking about IQ, if we're talking about the ability to relate to people, like just on the matter of the ability to relate to people, people who are severely autistic are like they're not functionally autistic. They're not functional autists. They can't manage themselves if they're severe enough. And so people are not all equal. Not if you presuppose naturalism. Now, if you presuppose the Bible and you say, well, we can build a morality off of the Bible, and you say that the Bible does say that all people are equal because the Bible does say that we're all equally made in the image of God, then you say, okay, that's what it says, but now that's the principle, that's the deontological principle, that's the prescription. What are the nuances to that? At what point does somebody at what point is it just for somebody to sell themselves into slavery? And that's the question that we're talking about, because if you presuppose a morality at all, you have to figure out where the morality is coming from. And if you are presupposing that people are all equal, there are only a few moralities out there that can actually get you to that point. And one of them is the monotheistic, biblical, Judeo-Christian morality. And because that's based on the Bible, and the Bible nuances that in these specific ways, then what we're talking about now is the reality, the true natural law of human justice. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. Sounds good? That's the principle. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. So this is talking about the cities of refuge. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Okay, so whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. Now, the question is, does that include when somebody does not intend to? And he answers that immediately. No, if he does not intend to kill him, if it's not in his will to kill the person, then he's not put to death. He gets to flee to a city of refuge. Here's the question then. At what point, or no, here's the question. It says, but God let him fall into his hand. Now, this is a Calvinist question. If man does not will to do something, God wills for it to happen, and he uses man for it to happen, but the man did not have a choice in the matter, the man is not held accountable because it's not his fault. So, if man does not have will, and all things are directed entirely by God without any human input, according to God's law, that the humans cannot be held accountable. Therefore, no punishment for humans. Punishment for humans is impossible. Therefore, if punishment for humans exists, then man has free will, plain and simple. But this is going to be important in the slavery discussion too. Whoever strikes his father, his mother, or his mother shall be put to death. So what does it mean to honor your father and mother? Well, first of all, striking them is not that. So whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. And this is, of course, in an honor-shame society. It's not talking about like if you get in a tussle with your dad or something like that. It's talking about a worthless son who who is unrepentantly trying to, let's say, join a band of misfits or whatever, join a gang, and this is actually fairly frequent, but a lot of times a gang would have you do something horrible to your parent, a parent of yours, in order for you to fit in. Whoever does something horrible to his father or mother shall be put to death. Now, an interesting thing, and Paul Copan references this, but it's a conclusion that scholars have come to, according to Paul Copan, that there are 16 different ways you can be put to death, or different reasons you can be put to death. Now, in only one of these instances of being put to death, does it say, and you shall not have a redemption, or you shall not have a substitute. And that's with murder. So, whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Does that mean that he has to be put to death? No, but it does mean that the crime is befitting death. And that means the only way is for something to die. The only way for him to be alleviated of this crime is for something to die. And so he has to bring a substitute, which is a lamb, a bull, or somebody else can take his punishment for him. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of that man who was stolen, shall be put to death. And what's that saying? Do not buy slaves who were stolen. So, in other words, antebellum South, entirely illegal according to God's law. Slavery in America was entirely illegal according to God's law. Not only is it wrong to steal a person and sell him, it's also wrong to be in possession of the person who was stolen. And what does that mean? If you find out that he was stolen, you are just supposed to let him go immediately. That is what you do. Why? Because if you don't, you're going to be put to death, or you have to pay a hefty, hefty fine continually. Because, somebody finds out that you have a slave, you're like, oh, you have a slave, okay, and you leave and you pay, you do the substitution thing. Then someone else comes, say, oh, you have a slave, or oh, okay, pay the substitution. Like, it's God is saying, you shall not have a stolen person. The only way you can have a slave is if they willingly put themselves in slavery. That's the only way. Or if someone in authority over them did this. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. So same thing as before. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. Okay, so this is juxtaposed with the slave instance in the next command. If men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time. Now, there are a few elements of this, but let's move on to the next one. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Now, what does it mean to be avenged? Well, verse 12, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. That's what it means to be avenged. So if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies, then he gets put to death. What does that mean? Don't strike your male or female slaves with a rod. That's not what you do. Again, antebellum South, entirely illegal. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Now, what does that mean? It goes back to verse 19. Then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. The only difference here So if he strikes a free man, he shall be clear. If he continues a couple days and then dies later, still he's clear. That's what it's saying here. Same thing with the slave. The slave and the free man are not treated differently here. The only difference is the free man shall be paid for the loss of his time and shall have and he shall pay for him to be thoroughly healed. The slave is not paid for the loss of his time. And why is that? Because the slave is paying the master with his time. And so there's just no way to reconcile that. But he shall be thoroughly healed, because this is the precedent, and it's the deontological principle. Now, and it's weird because it jumps back and forth between like free men and then slaves. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out. Now, I know that there's a lot of controversy on this verse here, but I think the people who think that this passage is talking about abortion are stretching, like they're reaching. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, there shall be no harm. But there is no harm. The one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. Okay, so the question is, where is the harm? Is it to the woman? He hit her. Of course there's harm. That's assumed. So if there's no harm, then the man who hit her shall be fined. How much? Well, however much her husband determines, depending on the amount of damage dealt to her. On top of that, if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. If there is harm to what? Not to the woman, because we've already covered the harm to the woman. It's whatever the man shall impose and whatever the judges impose. Now, what are the judges going to impose? Well, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, all that sort of stuff. Now, what about if there is harm? Harm to who? Not to the woman, we've already covered that, but harm to the baby. If the baby comes out with a withered hand, well, hand for hand. Now, of course, this is not really talking about you're going to take the person who struck the woman and chop off his hand. This language echoes the Code of Hammurabi, because the Code of Hammurabi literally says eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Now, my suspicion is that at the time of its original writing, which was, I think, in like 2200 or something like that, it was really early, or 2000, which would have been like 5 to 8 years before this time. It might have meant eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but 5 to 800 years is a long time for a law to evolve. So by this time, what does eye for eye, tooth for tooth mean? Well, it means monetarily. If the foot is severed, then whatever a foot is worth, the guy has to pay. And this is why when it says, when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there's no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined. Why? Because if she's harmed, if she got a severed hand, then he pays the fine, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, on top of the fine that the judges determine. But if there is harm to the baby, now, of course, life for life. If you killed the person, then you pay with your life. But all the other ones, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, those are different. You pay with money. Because, how do we know this? Because it says, he shall surely be fined, and he shall pay as the judges determine. The only time he pays with more than money is when it's life for life. But now it's switching back to the slave. So it was with the free woman, now it's with the slave again. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. So he's not fined, in other words, because he bought the slave and he has a 7-year period. If the master beats his slave and the slave loses a tooth or an eye, then he goes out free. Master, and that is a fine ultimately, because he did not get his money's worth from the slave. Now, let's just lay out a scenario. Let's say somebody lends you $50,000 and you to buy a house. You go buy a house with that, and then all of a sudden there's a famine the next year, and you're paying back this guy, but you haven't paid anything because you pay with crops. And so there's a famine and you lose all your crops. He's fine, but you don't know, like, some people are able to help, some people are able to, but you lose all your crops and you can't pay for anything, so you have to sell yourself into slavery. You go into debt, and you're in debt already. You lose the house, and it goes back to whoever bought it. And then you're just destitute. What do? You can't pay this $50,000, so you sell yourself into slavery. Now, let's say the next day the man gets drunk. Well, $50,000 is, I guess, 7 years today. Yeah, that's roughly the amount of time to pay $50,000 back. So let's say a year from now, the master gets drunk. You were, let's say, not the best worker or something like that, and so he gets really mad at you. And let's say you're stiff-necked. You're just like, I don't need to be a slave, but you do, because you sold yourself into slavery because you have to pay your debt. And the master gets really mad, and he decides to, and he's drunk. He decides to take a fire log and throw it at you. And it hasn't been caught on fire yet. It seems relatively innocent to him. He throws it at you. It hits your face right in the mouth. You lose a tooth. Well, now you go to the judge, say, he knocked a tooth out of me, and here's my witness. I still owe him like $45,000. Now, what does the judge say? Well, you knocked a tooth out of him. The $45,000, it is nullified. That's an expensive tooth. And this is why when we read the Bible and we're talking about slavery, these slaves had like significant rights. They were fully human. They had full human rights. And the only nuance here is that they didn't have, well, I actually didn't get into this, but they also didn't have prisons. So this actually might be a bit more of a realistic example. Let's say you are a thief and you go to this guy's house. You steal $10,000 worth of jewelry or whatever. Or let's go back to the $50,000. You steal $50,000 worth of jewelry. You leave. You pawn it all off. You sell it to Midianites or something, and then it's found out that it's you. They catch you. They tell you to pay back 4 times the amount that you stole, because that's the law, and that is $200,000. So you owe this guy $200,000 because you took $50,000 from him. Now, these were precious things. They belonged to his grandmother, and she got them from her grandmother. These are precious family heirlooms. It was like a one of them was a World War II katana that was like straight tamahagane or whatever. It was like traditional, excellent, generational katana passed down for like 500 years. Not only like that was from your great grandfather, and he stole that from you. So he doesn't just owe you $200,000. He owes you a lot more. Like he owes you this sentiment. He owes you like this honor and this pride of these heirlooms. And essentially part of like for you, that's part of the memory and soul of your grandfather. And then same stuff, he stole jewelry from your grandmother. And these were things that you were going to pass on to your children. So not only did he rob you, not only did he rob your father and your grandfather, he robbed your children of their family heirlooms. So he comes into your house because they don't have prisons; they have debtors slavery. So let's say penal slavery, where he owes you $200,000. He's not going to pay that back. There's no way. So they just say, well, okay, you sell yourself into slavery for him. And not like on top of that, he's a Hebrew, he's a Jew, meaning he only has to work for you for 7 years. And he stole all this from you. So naturally, you get drunk one night, you're mad. You're mad as heck at him. And you beat him. And you knock out a tooth. Well, that was a big mistake. Because that tooth just lost you everything. That one bit of anger lost you everything. Now, let's say you beat him so that he dies. Well, you you die. Now, whether that's fair, you die. Let's say you beat him so that he is maimed. First of all, he goes free because of that. Second of all, you have to pay for him to be healed. If he's not healed and he dies, well, you still lost 50,000, like an infinite amount of money's worth. And you got nothing out of it. And then let's say he doesn't die. Well, he's still free. You get nothing. It's a terrible investment strategy to beat your slaves, in other words, according to the Bible. Now it moves beyond slavery. When an ox, now it's moving to animals. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. Oh, so I want to actually add a little more to the slavery discussion. So, 7 years, it's all you can own a slave for. This actually was a really great way for God to abolish slavery because, okay, it's a necessary element of society, at least in their society. And you could even argue it's a necessary element in our society. We've just adjusted the definitions a bit. But let's say that they're a non-Jew. Let's say they are a ger, a foreigner in the land of Israel, and they sell themselves because they go into debt. Well, at that point, converting is a pretty good idea. Well, what if they convert? Well, now you can only own them for 7 years. What if some traveling Midianites, they come in and they sell you some slaves, and they promise that none of these slaves were stolen, because if they are stolen, then that's a really bad idea to have them. But you're assured that none of them are stolen. They come in, they don't even speak the language, but hey, okay. Then they learn the language and they learn the culture, and then at some point they either realize that they can just convert, or they just fall in love with God and his law, and they convert. In either of those instances, now this foreign slave that didn't even know that Israel existed comes in, and he is now just like that. He is set free after 7 years. It is slavery in the Bible is, in other words, a really good way for slavery to be abolished, because if you combine all of the laws together into a single cohesive system, there's absolutely no way for you to maintain any sort of hold on slavery. It's just gone. It's still an option for like penal slavery or for debt slavery, but even then, it's like not you don't get to maintain it forever. You don't get slaves for life, in other words. And it's sort of interesting here because what this means is if slavery becomes entirely unfeasible, except for in special instances, then it just fizzled out and dies. And what does that mean? Well, it means that there's not a drop of blood spilled in order to abolish mass slavery. And makes you wonder if the South obeyed every single law in the Bible, slavery would have looked way different, and it would have just become entirely economically undoable. But they didn't follow every law in the Bible, and therefore it was an atrocity. And that's the only reason it was, is because they didn't obey what the Bible said. You see, this is actually one of the interesting this is one of the things that people who don't actually read the Bible very seriously, this is one of the mistakes they make. They'll read these verses in isolation as if they are meant to be read in isolation. Like when a man strikes the eye of a slave, male or female, and destroys it, the slave shall go off free. And be like, oh, that sounds horrible. You have masters striking their slaves? Oh, horrible. And it is horrible, which is why God legislated against it. But you can take those verses in isolation and sort of just run with them. And you can say, oh, well, people, as long as you hit their back, then you can beat them as much as you want. You could do that. And as long as you hit their feet, then you can do it as much as you want. You can beat them. But then you're like, okay, what about when you read the rest of the passages? If you strike them in the back and something happens to an organ, well, you're in big trouble. If you strike them on the foot and you maim them, you're in big trouble. Now, where is it? Here in verse 19. He will pay for the loss of his time, and he shall have him thoroughly healed. Pay for the loss of what time? The time that he was in the hospital? Well, this is under the assumption that he walks outdoors with his staff, meaning maybe he was only a little maimed. Maybe he can go back to work. What if he walks out and now he's a cripple? Ooh, that's a different scenario. Now, pay for the loss of his time is a bit more serious. Now it means just pay for the rest of his life money so that he can survive. You see, that's a bit of a different scenario. What if you do that to your slave? Well, it's the same thing. Eye for an eye, tooth for eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. They go free. Foot for foot. If you maim them so they cannot work, not only do they go free, but they're still Hebrews. They're still made in the image of God. They still have their rights. They're only contingently slaves, but they are necessarily free, which means, or they are contingently slaves, but they are essentially free, which means when they go free and the cause of their maiming is you, now verse 19 applies, because you've still maimed a free man. You still pay for the loss of their time, and you still pay a lot of money. So yeah, verse 26 seems horrible if you read it without the others. But this is why these cynical atheistic cynics, they come and they cherry pick these verses and they directly apply it to antebellum South or whatever. That's not how it works. You have to read all of these as a system, a single civic system that is to be built upon in order to protect the people involved. You actually have to take it seriously, in other words. Moving on to verse 28. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. Okay. Oh, and then of course, now this is actually one of the instances where, okay, he's put to death, but he didn't kill the guy directly. So if a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him, so he can redeem himself. If he can't do that, then he has to ask for his family to do that, or he can ask for the collective to do that. But that makes him a really unpopular guy, makes him a shameful guy, and he probably loses a lot of, like, all of his property. Then he has to sell himself into slavery. Go figure. So it's a bad idea to let your oxes run wild. So an ox scores a man or a woman to death. The first time, the ox is stoned. Now, how the heck does verse 29 then follow? But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, well, he can gore not unto death, of course. So if he is in the habit of being violent, then you're supposed to keep him inside, and maybe he's an ox, so he's kosher, so you can raise him up as a meat cow or something, a meat ox, but you can't use him to till. Well, I really don't know a thing about tilling, so I take what I say with a grain of salt here. But you can't use him for certain things. If you then try to use him for certain things, and someone comes up and he comes and gores the person and they die, well, now you have to be put to death. In other words, God is making it very economically difficult to use oxes for work when they're a hazard. So the first time, if this is the first time he's ever gored somebody and they're put to death, or and they die, then the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. So he gets nothing out of it. If he has been violent in the past, people have been maimed, but they haven't died, and he has just been flippant with it. He has been not reliably keeping him in, not being responsible. He's being irresponsible with it. And then he gores somebody and that person dies. Then he gets put to death because he was not being responsible for his animal. But if a ransom is imposed on him, he can redeem himself. If it gores a man's son or daughter, so not only is the ox put to death, so it's stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. But so he doesn't get to eat it, it's put to death, but he can pay a ransom. So, but at that point, he can't sell the ox as a ransom because the ox can't be, the ox has been stoned and it can't be eaten. So there's no use for it anymore. So he has to pay the ransom with his other animals. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to this same rule. So if he gores a man's son or daughter, then he's to be put to death and he's ransomed for it. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Now, this is another one. Oh, no, this is horrible. Well, again, this has to be read in context. This is a law building on the other laws. If the ox, so first of all, if this is the first time the ox has ever gored somebody, then of course the owner's not going to be put to death. But regardless of whether, oh no. Let me rephrase that. The owner of the ox shall not be liable, which means this penalty, the 30 shekels of silver, will not apply because this is the first time the ox has done this. Somebody maybe harangued it or whatever and made it mad. If it has been accustomed to goring in the past and now it gores a slave, well, now its owner shall be put to death and the owner shall pay 30 shekels of silver. So on top of the ransom that's imposed on him, he shall give out of all of the either money or his other animals or his field or his house or whatever. Not only will he have to pay that, but now he also has to pay 30 shekels of silver. Now, this is what, again, those cynical atheists, they'll read this verse and say, oh, well, if a person is gored to death, then he gets put to death. But if a slave is put to death, then it's only 30 shekels of silver. But no, that's not how this is supposed to be read. It's this plus the other verses in this category, because that person that was gored, although he's a slave, he's still a person. And so because he's a person, it's still a man or a woman that gets gored to death. But because he's a slave, there's an additional penalty for the goring. And so it's not an either or, it's a both and. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. Now that's interesting because basically he's like, oh, he fell, and now I just pay and I buy him. So break it, you buy it. In other words, when one man's ox butts another one's, so that it dies, and they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also they shall share. So this one's a funny one. If one ox goes and kills another ox, then this guy kills his own ox. Wait. No. Then they sell this ox somewhere. Now it's just really funny. What if they sell it to the guy that gored the guys whose ox got gored? Well, this guy's ox is sold, and then they split the money. And not on top of that, they share the dead beast. So they, whatever the choice meats are, the leather, the hair, whatever they use, they get to split it. So if he sold it to somebody else, but if he sells his ox to this guy, then he splits the money and they share the dead animal, the dead beast. And so the first guy, the guy whose ox gored the other guys, is just sort of left out to dry, essentially. He gets a third. No. Wait, what was it? Yeah, he gets a third, a quarter less than what he would have gotten before. No, he gets a third less than what he would have got before. And the other guy, he gets a third more. If it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past and its owner has not kept it in, so again, the same situation, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. So, in other words, if he gores another guy's ox and he knew that and he was being irresponsible. Then he gives the problem ox to this other guy, and this other guy gives the dead ox to him. Now, that one I'm a little confused by, because like I just, then the one guy gets stuck with, I mean, he could kill the ox now, I suppose he has that choice, or he can try to break it in more. Or I suppose he could till with the ox in a more responsible manner. So he has more freedom to do with the one ox what he wants. The other guy just has a dead ox. So there's that. So I think, man, that was a long chapter, but I'm going to stop there for this week. And yeah, we're continuing in Exodus, and we had a good deal to talk about slavery, which is always a fun topic. Like, I think, well, I'm not going to make jokes about it because I don't want to be canceled, but it's a topic that people who are pseudo in pseudo intelligentsias, pseudo intellectuals, they sort of make it an idol, but it shouldn't be. There's no golden cow of slavery. Um, there is just slavery and there is unjust slavery. What we experienced here in America was unjust slavery. What the Bible is talking about is just slavery. And the problem, or the difference between the one versus the other, is the one made humans subhuman and gave the master full authority to do whatever they wanted. What the Bible, when the Bible talks about slavery, it never does that. If the man is, or the one who is sold into slavery is never considered subhuman. He is either somebody who's in debt, a poor guy, in other words, or he's a criminal. Now, when you're a criminal, you sort of sell your rights a little bit in order to perform a crime. So there, and we have prisons. It's essentially the same thing as slavery, um, except we have loopholes. But in biblical slavery, they retain their rights as humans. They are fully human, and the master has limited control over them. Only enough control over, or authority over them and control over them in order to uh, pay the debt. And then, even then, if the debt is, whether the debt's high or low, after the 7 years are up or after the debt is paid, whichever comes first, the slave gets to go free entirely. And so it's a just slavery, in other words. And, considering the connotation of slavery here in America, I don't even think you should call it slavery because it's just so different. But that's what we call it. And it, for better or worse, we're going to use that word. And it's just one of those things that you have to get out of your own cultural context in order to accept the biblical cultural context. And that's just part of being a believer. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or you disagree with me on anything I've said, feel free to comment down below. And of course, you can always like, subscribe, and I guess they say like, subscribe, and comment, but I already said that. So like, subscribe, and I'll see you next week.